Welcome to the Balance and Brilliance podcast, a space where different perspectives and ideas converge to create powerful change. I'm your host, Terrence Hanna, serial entrepreneur and performance coach, and I'm joined by host Zoe McMahon, Fortune 100 executive and lifelong change maker. In this show, we share our complementary experiences and perspectives on topics that both propel and limit us all. We hope that by tuning in, you're able to launch yourself further with balance and brilliance. Like and subscribe to support the channel, and be sure to drop a comment below to lend your balance and brilliance to the world. Let's dive in. We've talked about the leadership aspect of this. We've talked about the importance of autonomy, the importance of the plan, and all of these different pieces. I think the magic of where the true magic lies is in unifying that autonomy. And that's something that I think, in this discussion that we're having right now around everybody has their own ideas and opinions and their own skills and all of that. In your experience and education and you leading teams, how do you unify the individual autonomy that you provide to your staff? What are some strategies that our listeners can glean from you?
I really think we've talked a little bit about this, um, first of all, recognizing that everybody's different. So as a leader, what it means to create and give the power to the people to support my vision, it's going to be different in each individual case, right? So simply having a stated team vision or mission or whatever could work for some people. Connecting back to some of the things that they care about or maybe more their personality might work for some other people. So I think it really depends on the people. Is being very adaptive as a leader. Because on your team you've also got different levels of experience. So applying something like situational leadership where you've got people on your team that are maybe don't need any guidance and are super experienced. Well, that's a certain mode of leadership, whereas people more junior need something else. So as a leader, I think you're constantly looking strategically and observing this ecosystem and the resources that you've got around you and figuring out how best to inspire and deploy them. But how to inspire and deploy them varies, I think, quite a bit by
Mhm.
different people. Um, I think the other thing, going back to the switch book, is making we haven't talked about the path. We talked a lot earlier about the elephant and needing to appeal to people's emotions of, um, make the case that the new direction is going to be emotionally better than the current situation. Otherwise, they're not going to budge their elephant. But I was leaning more into the path, right? Making it easy for people making it simple and easy for people to change. So if we want to give people that autonomy and to drive people to embrace your ideas, make it easy for them to do so, right? Make it easy for them to follow the thing that you want them to be doing. Make it simple. So often we stop in strategic management. So often we stop at planning and visualization, but I want. There's a famous quote that I use a lot, which is um, sort of strategy without implementation is hallucination, right? Or something words to that effect. And a lot of the time we spend a lot of time thinking about what we want to do and inspiring and creating all the artifacts around the direction. And until you start getting into actually driving that into processes and metrics and feedback loops and whatever, until you start doing that, it's hallucination the whole way. And so often change efforts kind of get stalled because of a failure of follow through
Mhm.
of putting the measurable, tangible, actionable things in place and then learning from them on the way. So I think summary of what I found to be effective in terms of inspiring the crowd to follow you. Is like, yeah, recognize they're all different, but make it easy for them as well. And but measure them. Focus on measurement, having the right measures in place so that we get the feedback. Otherwise, how do we know? How do we know if we've been successful?
I think feedback is critical. There's a few things actually I'd love to build on there. As somebody who spends a lot of time talking with you, something I know you're very good at is personal relationships. Something I think that is incredibly important regarding unifying autonomy is knowing your people. And
Mm-hmm.
I mean that in not just a skills sense, but a personal sense. Why does it matter to them? Like, is this person working for you a single parent? Is this person working for you passionate about sports? Is this person working for you passionate about entrepreneurship or whatever the case may be? And in any one of those cases, it allows the ability for not only you to understand how they would, use that autonomy, but it gives them ownership and knowing that, they're contributing their skills. And something that I think is incredible in a real life example. So in our radio show that we do, or did I should say, um, we did several episodes on tell us something new about yourself, because we had a regular group of people who we would talk to, and it was a very large group of people, but it was absolutely incredible to see all of these people with their hands up and coming up on stage. And we just literally had days of listening to people talk about things. And, some people were just one off the top of my head, executive chefs. Another person was an actor. And like these were all things that laid completely outside of the scope, kind of what we were doing there, if you will. But every one of these skills was remarkably applicable in one way, shape, or form, even though it wasn't the like foundational driving force. So, ex- from if you want to look at that from like the cold steel press mindset, you want to extract as much value as you can out of your workforce. And in my experience, the there is so much value. The majority of the value lies under the surface. And so I think that's something in my experience that I would totally build off of those
Mm-hmm.
amazing points that you had brought up, is just knowing the individual members of your team and then fostering, in a larger setting, fostering that type of culture to trickle downward.
Yeah, I mean, I love this, and relationships are like key to the whole thing. And I think I started out with that point that any change in organizations is ultimately about changing people. And so
Yeah.
understanding people is absolutely part of that. And there's something else that I think is fun that is often not talked about, is kind of role of the informal organization in driving change. And what I mean by this is there's a conventional hierarchy, right, of boss and manager and whatever. And you'd think that when you were driving change, you needed to talk to the leader and you needed to, follow a certain protocol. That is not how real change works, right? Real change works by influencing the influencers and kind of nudging in a certain direction and leveraging this kind of, well, who might be able to help me like nudge this in the right direction. And so I think as a change agent, uh breaking out of the I need to convince to the boss, I need to talk to the boss. It's like, well, yeah, but maybe on the way you need to talk to people that the boss listens to. And maybe the people that the boss listens to is, part of your swim club or something else, or maybe you've got a link in common. And so navigating that relationship network as much as the individual relationships, I think is super key to getting anything done in organizations, far more than the official rounds.
I strongly agree. I think, it's something I know we had discussed prior to this, that so let's take a look at the adoption curve for a second, actually, and I'll throw it up on screen here so people can follow along with us. But when you're talking about the innovators, the creators, the people who are going to be standing up dancing alone, to use your video analogy, with everyone's looking at you feeling, thinking you're crazy, you're about 1% of people fall within that sort of innovator line. Then the next stage is you've got the early adopters, and you're about 12% ish, give or take, on the early adopters phase. Then you get into the early majority. And it's the point in between the early majority and the late majority where the adoption growth curve crests, as you know. And that's where the vast majority of people come in. And then on the tail end, you have the laggards. Um, so I think, to tie this back to what you were talking about with identifying key stakeholders and people who are going to help sort of widen the net to push that
Mhm.
change forward. I think it's important to identify, and again, knowing your team or knowing the people, is who are the early adopters, who are going to be the people who are going to be most receptive to this change. And then we can talk to those key stakeholders, present the benefits, the challenges of the change, and tell them, give them that autonomy to say, you know, do you like this? Yes. Okay. You like it. Great. You have an amazing set of skills and I think could be instrumental in driving this change. Can you help me? And I think that right there really lays a foundation for getting that rock off the ground. Now, something else that I think is fascinating when you're talking about the adoption curve is something called, your critical mass. Can you talk a little bit about that and your experience in gaining critical mass in a movement?
You know, I think the best analogy I would have for this is um, I at some point in my career I was asked to lead a function that we were quite short staffed, I would say. Had a few people in it, and one might call it understaffed, but it was what it was, and I had to kind of grow a virtual network. I had very limited resources in my team to do the things I needed to do, and yet the outcome that I needed was quite widespread change. And so the creation of a network of change agents was something that I needed to build. Um, and so I've done that a few times, especially with this concept of influence without authority. When you're not the one in charge, all you can do is to create a kind of network effect of change agents.
That's an
And so,
episode on its own.
yeah. So as I look back, when that department that I was leading, it was like six people in 2018, 2015. By the time I left that role, the team itself was like 25 and the network around it was probably 75 people, and that had all been brought along into the effort that we were trying to do. And so um I'm trying to think about that network and when did it pass that line of adoption? When did it become cool to hang out with Zoe on her mission? Like I was trying to think through that. Um, and some of it is around something that I was going to mention, which is again, it's sort of psychology, organizational psychology a little bit, but when your peers are doing it and you're not doing it, it's kind of like, why don't I have one of those? You start to get into this sense of like I'm missing out or FOMO or whatever. So
Early majority, late majority adoption curve.
yeah, right. And so
Totally.
it's like, wait, I'm in a business and all the other businesses are over there hanging out with Zoe's topics. Why aren't we over there? So there's a little bit of that you could capitalize on, which I think is good. But also in the same vein, you get a lot. It's sort of relative to the adoption curve. When I've tried to drive change internally, one of the things I'll always get questions is, well, are our competitors doing it? And so like if our competitors are doing it, then we'll do it. And it's like it goes back to that curve. There's some sense that this is already happening out there. It's legitimate. I'm not going to be the first crazy guy to join you. I'm gonna do that. So I would often use these. I would use this in reverse to kind of get people on board, which would be like, it's already happening over here. You're already kind of in that missing out mode. Like, so recognizing that that adoption thing can happen, sort of educating people and giving visibility and transparency that we're not first to the table here. We can catch up. I think actually helps people adopt things because they feel like they should be at that point. But also something you said a minute ago around getting people on side in that process. Um, it's sometimes appealing to their ego a little bit, like say a particular person in a particular part of the organization that can have a distinctly different and unique effect on the topic that you're trying to drive change. So let's say they might, as a function of their role, be, leading digital marketing efforts. I'm just making it up.
Mhm.
Um, well, how can we use that person's other strengths to bring to the table whatever it is I'm going to try to do? Something I'm thinking about as well, not just for the effort, but also how to convince them. Say, well, you as that in your role can have like an unparalleled effect on this effort more than anyone else, right? In this team, you can bring something unique to it. And that's kind of appealing a little bit just to their personal ego, right? That they
But
want to
is
be
it
valued.
false? Is it, and this is the thing,
No,
is I
it's
know it's
true.
not. I know it's not.
No.
So
Yeah.
the beauty though is that, and to me, this is one of the most powerful parts of leadership and being an inspiring figure to your team, is the fact that you can know them and you can legitimately look at them and truthfully say to them, you are the magic here. You are the person. And I mean, that is so, like, people naturally want to employ, like, people want to show, like, look at this, look at what I can do. And it's amazing to see that in a team.
Well, and
And
it's a bit like the Maya Angelou quote about people don't never remember what you said or did, they remember how you made them feel.
feel,
And
yeah.
so with that person who is being kind of enrolled into the effort is feeling great about working with you because they're feeling recognized. And this can happen. I've done this a lot, not just in my own organizations. I've had more application of this outside of my direct team because that's how, in your direct team you've got a certain accountability that they have to kind of, have to listen to you anyway, right? But as soon as you're stepping outside anyone that you're immediately responsible for and trying to influence wide networks of people, this type of thing is really important.
Well, and I think this, something to touch on here, seeing as we're talking about the adoption curve, and this is not necessarily looking at the curve as much as the stages, but the different leadership or management styles that one would have to employ through the different stages. So,
Mm,
creation of a concept requires a lot different um,
right.
thought process than the adoption, which requires a lot different process than the diffusion, right?
Mm,
So something to tie this together, you were talking about the agents of change that are required. So gathering or surrounding yourself with the agents of change is a very different process than keeping a unified vision within the autonomy of those agents of change, which is a different process again than the creation. So I think that, there being, in even in that sense, it's change, right? It's
right.
and
Yes, as you exactly what you need when you're driving change changes.
it's change, yeah.
It
Absolutely,
changes
yeah.
over time what you need, right? In the beginning, you need certain kind of skill sets and personalities, maybe, and then later on, you need other skill sets and personalities. And this goes a little bit to around the discipline of execution. That to manage the discipline of execution requires very different behaviors and skills than the development of the strategy, right? So depending on where you are in these change cycles will dictate the different needs that you might have. And so recognizing that is important. And this actually relates to something else that, again, maybe tying it a bit more to the individual and their experience of change inside of organizations. Um, there's a great book um, that I use all the time, which is called The First 90 Days. And it was written with the intention of helping people in their when they change careers, right? So you go to a new company, what are you going to do in the first 90 days? And it has like lays out a formula for how to orient yourself in the organization and how to have a conversation with your new management so that you're clear on expectations, things like that. But I think the strength of that book is that it's really about transitions. And transitions are occurring all the time, as we've said, perhaps too much. But it could be that you didn't change jobs. It could be that you just changed bosses, or it could be that you got a new team member, or it could be that your mission slightly changed based on the circumstances of the company, or it could be that the budget just completely changed outside of your control. And so, kind of again, back to this orientation OODA loop thing, the first 90 days book is great for, okay, I am in a transition here. Let me take a step back and revisit that and start again. And too often people don't realize that they're actually in a transition, right? So that's another one I think people might find helpful when they're experiencing change and kind of gravitate yourself back to, okay, let me get organized again.
Absolutely. You know, and just touching on that, something I think is important is just really like thinking through each step and understanding that it's not always going to feel normal, right? Like so just this is kind of rewinding and talking, building off of your first 90 days thing. But I think that when you get into the innovators, or as you work your way through the adoption curve, and I think that a lot of people listening to this podcast are probably going to be the innovators and early adopters. Um, but the closer to the front end of the adoption curve that you get, the more discomfort you're going to feel, right? So as a creator, or as somebody who's putting something brand new out for the first time, there's an inherent level of discomfort that's going to be involved in that. And then the early adopters, there's going to be but it's going to be less. And then when you get into the early majority, you've got case studies that you can build off of that are going to increase that comfort further. Um, but one of those things where I think some people may feel discomfort in this type of an idea, or the letting go aspect of it, is I think there's somewhat of a contradictory belief between, you know, what people think may work and what is most effective. So I kind of put some thought into on this is, again, I know I mentioned this before, but as a leader, when you're leading and driving change, you want to make sure that all of the parts of the car are moving in the same direction. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that your job at that point is delegation of appropriate ownership amongst the individual stakeholders. And the actual ownership of those items belongs to the stakeholders that are being a part of that. I'm not necessarily talking about equity, I'm talking about responsibility. And so being somebody who is surrounded by a team that has different and unique and valuable skill sets, you need to trust those people that are around you, that they're going to lead the change that you are orchestrating as a group, unified under this common vision of, this is the future we all want, and we're all lending unique skills, to make this happen. And I think that's really what's going to get you um to that level of critical mass. Sort of it's approximately like 13% ish, of potential stakeholders who would tip that into critical mass. What are your thoughts on that? Do you have anything to correct or add?
No, I get it, and I think you mentioned something interesting, which is trust. trusting the people to take it forward. And that's definitely, a big topic. Um, there's some interesting, there's a trust triangle that I'm familiar with that sort of relates to what you were talking about, that establishing trust with another, or in these, let's say a team member versus you, the first component of trust is capability. Do they have the capabilities that they need to have to do the job? Second is their do we have an aligned vision? Do we have an aligned sense of where we're headed? Do we have a shared outcome in mind? Because if I don't believe your outcome is the same outcome as I want, I don't trust you, right? Because we're off in different directions. And the third is whether we trust their inherent motivations of being sort of good or bad, right? Which most often in companies, there isn't that really much to talk about there. But so whenever there's a kind of question around trust between teams, trust between people, I'm often looking at, is it that they don't trust their capabilities? And so the remedy for that is easy. It's training and other things, skills development. Is it that I don't trust that they have the same outcome as mine as me? Totally different set of actions needed to establish that trust, right? And do I trust their motive at all? Are they just bad people? Well, that's a whole other issue that you would need to solve. But I think knowing when you're feeling like I can't trust this person to do the thing I need them to do, or I don't trust that other team. Really unpacking like what's behind that lack of trust can help you then establish that trust and continue the journey together of change. Because if you don't have people trust you, or they don't, you don't trust them, again, it's going to be a failure point in your execution.
I recently had a session with a client and something kind of along this lines came up, but I think it's very applicable here. But let's say you're leading a team of 10 people and you have one person on the team where this trust that you're talking about is
Mm,
somewhat of an issue. As a leader in that situation, by not addressing that one person, you lose the trust of all nine other people on that team. So I
mm,
think, it's really important in this sense, or anybody who's looking at moving into a leadership position, that you know part of change maybe reshuffling, organizing, or removing. That is a part of change that needs to be
yeah,
done. And it's not all sunshine and rainbows, and there's parts of it that we had talked about are going to be uncomfortable, right?
yeah,
um but I think that a sign of a good leader is somebody who's willing to do the difficult things when it's difficult, and somebody who's willing to innovate when it's easy. And I
yeah,
think that one other thing that I really wanted to touch on during this episode is the expectations of leaders. So I think the dynamic of this changes somewhat. Um, let's say you're taking a look at a startup. Expectations are going to evolve as that startup goes, but we had talked about this ebb and flow. And when you introduce a new change into the organization, you as a manager, somebody who trusts your staff and has given them autonomy, you need to change your expectations in that specific area as the change is unfolding. And what I mean by that is, if you have a professional hockey team and all of a sudden you remove the puck and you throw a basketball on and you want them to play with the basketball, they're going to score less goals. That's just, you know what I mean? And I think that's something that's a natural part, because celebrating the wins, monitoring that progress and adapting. um I think that those expectations through those very, very um difficult times, or those very fluid times, not to say that you need to eliminate expectations. Obviously there's still things that need to be accomplished, and things that need to be done. But I certainly think that allowing room for mistakes is, in any point of a company, is going to foster that culture of innovation. And, it allows people to generate new ideas and solutions. And the alternative to that is is less ideas and solutions. So it's kind of hard to refute that.
Yeah, I want to pick up on something you said in there around small wins. And it's actually one of my favorite papers that I've used as a manager. And it's a Harvard Business Review paper, and it's called The Power of Small Wins. And it basically, the premise based on some research is that, if you ask the average employee, did they have a good day today? And when the answer is yes, what was behind having a good day today? It was a sense of progress, a sense of like, okay, we're moving forward. So, in a lot of times in organizations, the mission may be long, right? The change effort might be long. And so waiting until like a year later to kind of acknowledge, oh yeah, we got there, right? That doesn't motivate employees on the way so much, right? So what makes people feel engaged and is feeling like they're making a sense of progress. And so as a manager and as a leader, kind of those feedback loops of, yeah, we are making progress, and here's what I mean by that. And then capturing those small wins during those changes where we're maybe adding a new player in, or getting rid of players that are disruptive, or simply changing the whole nature of the team because the game we're playing is different now. And that can happen too. As you're moving through that day by day by day, um, to avoid that sense of um, lack of control, or lack of, that destabilization that can occur when change is moving around you, communicating those small wins keeps everybody grounded in the kind of day to day, and keeps them engaged, and keeps everybody focused on the big goal as well. So I think what you said there about small wins is one of the most important things in actually implementing and executing change, is managing those.
Yeah, I agree. And, I kind of like to look at that metaphorically, and you know this very well. You and I have talked about this a lot, but looking at it through a lens of like stepping stones. If you tell your team, hey, I've got platform A and platform B is 5 kilometers away, and I want you to jump from A to B, no one's gonna jump. You know what I mean? That's unrealistic. But if you have stepping stones that go all the way across, and there's a victory on every stepping stone, people are not only more likely to go, they're incentivized to go because there's that celebration waiting every step of the way.
Definitely. It's all about employing, all change depends on people moving with you, and people have got to be engaged to be with you. I mean, they have to want to be on the journey, right? And building on your stepping stone analogy, I think what can happen is, even in that context where you're making small steps towards a big goal, if you don't look around the back and look at how far you've come every now and again, you're still going to be demotivated, right? And so I think there's that extra step of, don't forget to stand there on that stepping stone and celebrate being there, and look back at how far we've come. That brings to a close the second installment of our conversation on leading change. We sure covered a lot of ground here. If you missed the first half of this one, go back and check it out. But here's the summary of what we just covered in part 2. We pick it back up with Terry exploring what it takes to unify people, where I share the critical factors of recognizing diversity, being adaptive to the needs of your team, and making the path simple for people to follow. We touch on one of my favorite sayings, that strategy without execution is hallucination. There is always a risk that we stop at planning and fail to make change real for people. Execution involves measuring the right things to establish those critical feedback loops. Knowing your team and your network can help utilize that informal network in achieving change. And this can be as or more important than the formal network and hierarchical channels that you might expect. That informal network can help you identify those early adopters to get them on side and help you get those first rocks off the ground. Once you have those early adopters, now we need to establish the critical mass in the movement, including creating a desire for people to be part of the club and not to miss out on the action. Several times in this discussion, we touch on the fact that establishing personal relationships is critical Not just knowing people's skills and strengths, but also what's really going on underneath the surface with them. And in fact, more than simply knowing your team well, capitalizing on their particular strengths in the change effort and letting them shine for their part of it will help them feel recognized and valued. But coming back to our Challenges of Change episode, it's important to recognize that change is not always going to feel normal or comfortable. And in fact, the earlier you are in the adoption curve, the more discomfort you might be feeling. But to keep the car moving, we need to ensure that all parts of the car are moving forward at the same time. So this means you need to create a sense of responsibility in the whole team for their part of the change. And this further requires that you trust them and that they trust each other. If trust is a concern, identifying the root cause of any trust issues needs to be tackled quickly. And if there are players or circumstances that need to change, a good leader will face that head on. A good leader being someone willing to do the difficult things when it's difficult and innovate when it's easy, as Terry said. Finally, I think managing expectations of others on the way, including celebrating wins and progress, creates that solid engagement and makes the change more rewarding than waiting until the final stretch to start cheering. Well, that wraps up our insights on leading and driving change. If I was to summarize our thoughts across these 2 half episodes, I would say that change has to start with a people-centric approach. One that recognizes diversity, leverages informal networks, and that capitalizes on individual strengths. Secondly, execution is central, ensuring that your vision is clear, that all parts of the car are moving together, and with the destination in mind, measuring and establishing feedback loops and making that path to the goal really clear and simple. Finally, flexibility and adaptation are important on the way. Recognizing that change is not always going to be comfortable and recognizing the small wins on the way, reorienting as often as needed to stay attuned to the required steps for success are what is needed to keep going. Well, thank you for hanging out with us on our tour of leading and driving change. Good luck in your efforts and check out our other change episodes on the challenges of change and how to navigate it successfully when you're not the one leading it. Have a great day. Talk to you soon.